So we're familiar with this story that's from the gospel. They're traveling a long way, and the shortest distance is to go through Samaria. And normally, you wouldn't go through there. You take the long way around, but the shortest way was to go through Samaria. And they stop at Jacob's well. And Jacob's well is the oldest well. It's everyone in the Palestine knows where Jacob's well is. So most wells are covered, and they also have stone seats around them because you've been traveling a long way. It's extremely hot. You need a place to stop and rest. They also need food. So the disciples all go to buy food in the next town and leave Jesus by himself. And up comes a woman to draw water. And he breaks 3 huge taboos. But first, he talks to a woman. Her husband's not with her, none of her family members, none of the men, but he ends up asking her for water. And we on one hand know this taboo, and we know that it's wrong to break it and that he was really stepping out there, but we don't understand it fully. And I don't think I did until I went to the Middle East. I've traveled extensively in various parts of the Middle East. And when I went to Saudi Arabia, I actually dressed in the Islamic way. You were required to. And I would cover my hair, and it was like you disappeared. When I would go through a checkpoint, they would ask the man that I was with, not even for my ID. They would ask for his. He was my ID. As long as he said I was okay, they were okay. And I was floored by that they wouldn't even check to see, who I was or anything like that. And then when I went to Pakistan, and also the other thing in Saudi Arabia is that you can't just go into a restaurant or a coffee shop and sit down and have a coffee if you're a woman. If you're a woman with a man, you have to go to the family section, which is in the back. It has curtains around it because you have to expose your face to be able to eat. If you could do that, the meal normally costs $1 to $1.50 more, but you can't go into a normal restaurant and sit down like we do, or a coffee shop and eat. And finally, it got to be such a big pain in the butt that we would just go ahead and send the guys in, and we would sit out in the car, or we would get the food and then we would take it home. When I was in Pakistan, I would also have my hair undone and not covered, and we would come to a stoplight and we would look around, and every car all around would be staring at us. To the point, the guys that were with me were uncomfortable and said, "Please cover up." And so I started wearing Pakistani clothes and would cover my hair. And I asked an Islamic man that I worked with, "Why is it like that?" And he goes, "Well, you have to understand the culture. When you're an Islamic woman and dressed that way, then you belong to the man that you're with. And so it's impolite for anyone to stare at you, to talk at you. You belong to the man that you're with. And so nobody wants to start any fights. They're just not going to interact with you. But if you're dressed in the Western way, well, then you're fair game. You're obviously a loose woman." And, while we think of that and we can understand it intellectually, it's very different when you're living it. The second big taboo that he breaks is he talks to a Samaritan woman. Just beyond the fact that she's a woman, she's a Samaritan woman. And we know that those two groups don't get along, but they were enemies. The animosity between these two groups went down to hate. And it goes back a long time. When the northern kingdom was conquered by Syria, what they did was they took those conquered people and took them elsewhere. Then they took Assyrian people and put them in resettled, so these were pagan folks. They also took other conquered peoples from other areas and resettled them. So you have this huge number of mixing of people, and they intermarried, and their customs and their religion. And so there's a big influx of the pagan religion. Then sometime later, the southern kingdom also gets conquered. They get hauled off to Babylon. There's not that many people left. And when they come back to rebuild the temple, the people that are there are a mixture. They're mutts, they're mongrels. And that was, there's no Jewish identity to them, or if it is, it's been watered down. So they started treating them like Gentiles, and the people there that eventually became the Samaritans were not allowed to worship in the temple as Jews. Their gifts were treated as like an offering from a Gentile. So they said, okay, forget this. We're going to, like, most time in history with religion, we're going to break off and we're going to create our own religion, and we're going to build a temple up on Mount Gerizim. And when they did that, they only took the first 5 books of the Bible, the books of Moses. Now maybe that's the only scrolls they had. I'm not too sure about that, what happened there. But somehow the prophets got left behind, and that was not included as part of the religion. And that was a huge difference between the Jewish folks and the Samaritans. But the biggest thing is that they were so much, had so much animosity that a lot of times the Jewish people, when they would travel through Samaria, would go ahead and knock the dirt from the soles of their feet. They usually would go around. They wouldn't even go through it. They accused the Samaritans of attacking them when they would travel through. So there was a big thing for him to even say, to talk to a Samaritan at all. And she knew he was a Jewish man. He spoke with a Galilean accent, his clothes. She could immediately tell who he was. And finally, the third taboo that he broke was that he took something from her. He asked something from her. He could not touch her. He could not drink from her jar or from her cup without being ceremonially unclean. And what that meant was was a whole list of things that you can make yourself unclean. We know the most about the lepers, but it included all types of things, touching a body, touching someone who was unclean. And what you had to do then was, if you were unclean, you could not worship in the temple, you could not take any consecrated food. There was a whole list of things basically that you could not participate in. To become clean, you usually had to wait for a period of time. Usually the minimum was until the evening. So at least a day. Sometimes it was as much as 60 days or longer. You had to have a ceremonial bath. And then finally you might have to even go to make some sort of a sacrifice at Jerusalem before you would be considered clean. Like Middle Ages, when people didn't want to die without having a confession, making a confession and, quote, die in sin, this is the way they felt. You don't want to die with or have something bad happen when you're unclean. Who knows what would happen? So this was not a state that you would volunteer yourself to be in if you could help it. So she is astonished. This man who talks to her, because even though she's a woman, she's a Samaritan woman, and he's asking something that's going to make him unclean. Why are you asking me for water? And he replies, if you knew who it was that was asking you for living, for who you were asking for water, was asking you for water, then you would ask for living water. And why that's important is living water is spring water. That's what it literally means. And when I was on the Appalachian Trail, and if I were drinking spring water, I wouldn't bother to purify it. Purification took time and effort and money, and it was a huge hassle. So if there was a bubbling spring, especially if it was high up, I wouldn't bother. But lower or just a stream, well, forget it. I made sure that I purified it. And it was the same way for the Jewish people. The best water you could get was spring water. And it was also the best water for purification, and sometimes had to be used for some purification washing. But it's in short supply. There's not that many springs. So she's saying, she takes him literally. How are you going to give me spring water? You don't even have a bucket to get the drawn water. And he's going, living water, which is, he's really saying salvation, bubbles up into eternal life. So she's like, all right, well, I'm going to take you literally again. please give me some of that water, because I don't want to have to walk all this way to get water. This is a daily chore, that goes, it doesn't matter how much you collect, you always need more. Let me get rid of this. Give me some of that water. I don't want to draw it anymore. So Jesus says, go get your husband. She's like, I don't have a husband. He goes, yeah, you've had 5. Now, it's not real clear in the reading whether it's actually 5 husbands, which it might have been, because I know I have a great-grandmother who had 3 husbands. They kept dying, I mean, back then, people died, and you had a farm to run, you had kids to raise, so you needed to get remarried. The word can be interpreted either way, 2 different ways, either just a guy or a husband. So we're not real sure, because it's all based on context, but that's not the important part. The important part is she's living with a 6th man who is not her husband. So she's living in sin. She's an outcast, a shady lady. So also he's just talking to he knows she's a shady lady, and he's talking to her. So there's the 4th taboo. So what does she do as we frequently do when we're confronted with our sin? Changes the subject. We worship on this mountain, but you're supposed to say, you Jews say that we should be worshiping in Jerusalem. What about that? And he goes, and he doesn't say, hey, you're changing the subject. He doesn't rebuke her. He just gently says, well, there's going to come a time when worship will be in spirit and in truth. And the spirit is going to be, he didn't explain it. He didn't go into it. He just gives her the answer. And that's because in 70 years later, all of the temple worship is going to be gone. The Romans are going to come in and destroy it all. And we are worshiping God in the church age in spirit. He also explains that in truth, because she's asking these questions. Hey, we say we're right, you're saying you're right, so he answers. There's going to be truth, and the salvation comes from the Jews. He was standing before her. So she goes, hey, I'm dumb. And how many times do we do this? Again, when we're confronted with sin, or it gets a little bit too deep, when the Messiah comes, he'll answer it. I know I've said that. When I stand before God, he'll explain it all. And that's kind of a cop-out. I'm not saying that that's not true sometimes, that we can't understand it. But it's a way of saying, I don't want to have this discussion anymore. I'm like, let's go on to something else. But then he says something really important. I am he. And she just, the disciples came up, but she must have been dumbfounded because she believed him. She dropped her jar. She left it. So she'd come for water, but she takes off to the village with the living water, with the salvation. And she has to be one of the bravest people I know in the Bible. This is at a time when you could be stoned to death for a very simple religious belief that doesn't agree with everyone else's. She's a woman. She's an outcast. So she doesn't go back and say, I met the Messiah. I think in her heart she believed that. But she knew enough to say, I think I met somebody that might be the Messiah. But instead of just calling her crazy, they went out and said, okay, let's go see it. She didn't tell her story with shame. She didn't say this, and she didn't hide from shame and say, this guy told me all the things that I've ever done wrong, and I'm not going to go admit it to everybody else in the village. She didn't say it with pride. She was one of the first people in the Bible and a Samaritan, that Jesus proclaimed the gospel to. So basically a, quote, Gentile was told that he was the Christ. And that's what we are told throughout our lives, that we're not required for other people's salvation. All we're required to do is to share it. And frequently we feel that is it's our responsibility with how they react. And that's not it. What we are responsible for is we are responsible for sharing. And sometimes we don't feel that we know enough. Moses, he says that he had a slow mouth and a thick tongue. Send somebody else. And God said, no, you can be taught. And he was a prince of Egypt. Out of all the people of his time, he was probably the most educated Hebrew. But he still stood up to God and said, no, get somebody else to do it. My mom she has a higher IQ than I do, but because of the learning disabilities in our family, she's always been very reluctant. She feels very dumb. But my mom has been a Bible study teacher for 20 years. I never thought that I would say my mom's a Bible study teacher, but she felt called, and she's been doing it now for 20 years. Everyone has free will. We're not responsible for how they react. This Holy Spirit is going to touch their hearts. All we're called to is share. And sometimes we feel that sharing is kind of dumb. I don't know if we went around the room, God has touched all of our lives in some way. And if I were to tell the story of how he's touched my life, you'd sit there and go, yeah, that's a neat story, but, it doesn't mean anything to you because you didn't experience it. It's those individual experiences mean something to us, so we think they're foolishness. And the world is going to say, yeah, it's foolish, but that's not what we're called to do, to think what's foolish. We're called to share it. And the other thing that we do a lot of times is we take it as an insult when other people reject our beliefs. We think, well, if I would just explain it more, they would get it. And so we pound and we pound and we pound. And instead, we end up pushing them away because we're not listening. It's not an interaction between two people. So we have to learn how to openly share what we have without, and I don't want to say not caring, but without worrying what happens afterwards. God's going to take care of that. The only portion we have to do is to share the living water, and the Spirit will convert people's hearts.